I told Joyce she could say whatever she wanted, and she took advantage of that, so that's great. I can juggle, but I don't do acrobatics. It's good to see you, many friends and collaborators in the audience, and some of you know I was gone for a few years in Paris, and I'm back, so it's good to be reconnected with people. And I want to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the diversity, equity, inclusion issues that the energy industry is grappling with. Just a few comments, and maybe we can have some conversation about it, although I'm a little blinded, so if you raise your hand for a question or correction or comment, I might not see it. But one thing, I guess a couple things on my mind. Three aspects of this I think are particularly relevant when it comes to the energy sector and how it will unfold in the future. One is around inequities of who suffers from our energy decisions. There are issues around equity in terms of access, of who gets access to the good stuff with energy. And third is around diversity of workforce. And all are sort of problematic the way we do it now, although there's some good news and there's some things that we can look forward to that will be better. And the first one around inequities, and I know I'm going to say a bunch of things that a lot of you already know, so my apologies for repeating known things, but I think we need to give more attention to inequities of who bears the brunt of our bad energy and environmental decisions. And this isn't a new story, it's been the story for 100 plus years, but there's a lot of concern around fence line communities and what we burn and what kind of pollution it puts out and who's breathing in that air, or who has to deal with the truck noise or the pollution from tailpipes of the trucks delivering things to the power plant or the site where people are working. And this has real problems. And I think one thing COVID offered us was a chance to get a more specific view on this, because if you looked at COVID, the people who suffered the most tended people who already had exposure to air pollution, and the people who already had exposure to air pollution tend to be poorer brown and black communities. And so there's a much greater suffering with COVID, but there's already suffering in place because of the air pollution. So this is one of the vast inequities of the energy system of who suffers. Now in that modern context, it's fence line communities, black and brown people breathing air pollution. But there are other inequities historically, which is who gets forced to move when we build a dam that floods a system. So if you go back over the last 100 years, really like 90 to say 60 years ago, building dams throughout the United States, the story of building dams is that we would flood the Beverly Hillbillies, not Beverly Hills, right? We would flood the poor areas, often poor white areas, and often poor indigenous peoples areas, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So this is not a new story about fence line communities or who suffers from our decisions. It's a recurring theme, but now we have 100 years of learning on this, maybe it's worth taking action on that. And I think this is sort of something to have in mind, is that when we make a decision, who's going to suffer from that environmentally. I think if you read the story, especially like Cadillac Desert, if any of you know this book about the story of hydropower in the United States, and talking about there's the poor white town or the poor indigenous people's location, and every time we would flood the indigenous people rather than the white people. And so that's part of the history of dams, and actually one of the reasons why we quit building dams, because there started to become a lot of resistance where people said, enough, we can't pick up and move just because you want to dam. So we quit building dams in the 70s, and then we started to build coal plants. And so we moved from displacing people to flooding their airshed with toxic pollutants. And that's a challenge. So that we got to pay attention to that. And there's many examples, too many to list here. But inequities of who bears the brunt of our energy decisions is important. And the way the energy system works with our decisions we make today lasting 30 to 100 years, it's worth getting the decisions right. But a power plant or a dam or a road or an oil well or a pipeline will last decades. So there's great longevity with our decisions. It's worth taking a little more time to think it through, I would say. Now, and not building anything isn't really the best answer either, but we need to sort of balance the interests more accurately. So inequities of pollution. The second one is around equity of access, like who gets access to the good stuff. And there's a lot of good stuff coming, rooftop solar, batteries and power walls for resilience, Generac, backup systems, or whatever you have for your home for reliability, electric cars that are sporty and fun. These are all pretty exciting, and it mostly is going to people who are richer or have means or expertise or knowledge or access to the supply chain. And so there's a real challenge here, like who's getting the good stuff isn't everybody. A new paper came out a few months ago from Professor Duncan Callaway's lab at University of California, Berkeley, looking at this study for solar panels, and the rooftop solar panels are going to richer, whiter families, generally speaking. And the people who are, say, poorer aren't getting the solar panels. And even worse, in a lot of cities, there are rebate programs for the solar panels. And the rebate programs are great for incentivizing less air pollution and adoption of solar panels, but it buys down the cost for rich people to get solar panels. So the rich people now quit paying their electric bills because they don't have a bill, which underfunds the utility. And by the way, those rebates are often put into the rate base, and so poorer people are paying the rebates for richer people to get solar panels. This is a pretty typical phenomenon across the United States. You could say the same kind of things happening with tax credits for electric vehicles. You only get a tax credit if you pay taxes, you only pay taxes if you have a high income. And so these tax credits aren't available for people who don't pay enough taxes to make them worthwhile, but the cars are already expensive, at least today anyway, so people get priced out. So there's a real equity issue in terms of who gets access to the good stuff. And if you look around the world on access to energy, not just Austin or just Texas or United States, there are about 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to the better forms of energy or piped water, better forms of energy being things like propane or gas or electricity or solar, the cleaner stuff, as opposed to cow dung and wood and straw, the solid fuels that you burn. And burning those solid fuels kills 7 million people or so worldwide prematurely, millions of whom are women and children with these primitive fuels. So getting access to better forms of energy is a real problem, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and places like that, not United States, not Japan, Australia, or Western Europe. So there's equity to energy issues, but also access to piped water. So poorer people tend to get access to the pollution, but not the clean stuff. And we could use policies to adjust both, or planning to think about that. And I think that's the second point. So who gets the bad stuff and who gets the good stuff, and can we solve that? A third issue is around diversity of workforce. Who is in the workforce and therefore benefiting economically from the job and just sort of the growth and the prosperity that the energy industry offers? The energy industry hires a lot of people. It offers a lot of economic value for the individuals as well as us as a society. And who gets to participate in that sort of whole regime, so to speak, of employment and work and growth and career ladders? And there's a lot of diversity problems in the workforce as well. And it's better in some spots than others. Utilities are better than oil and gas companies. Oil and gas companies are better than coal mining. Coal mining is the single whitest industry in the United States. It is 95% white. It's like less than 5% sort of identify as non-white. There's no industry whiter than coal mining, which is kind of fascinating. I don't want to get too political, but it does sort of raise this question, like, why is there so much politics around protecting coal miners, which is sort of code for protecting white rural workers? It is not a diverse workforce. By the way, the second whitest industry in America is veterinarians. I'm not really sure why, but anyway, so it's coal miners and then veterinarians. And then oil and gas is better than coal mining, but not great. Electric and gas water utilities are better than oil and gas, but also the utilities are not great. But if you dig in a little bit at oil and gas companies, in fact, just yesterday there was a conversation at UT with Apache, sort of mid-major oil and gas producer and a services company representative, talking about diversity. Actually, oil and gas has pretty good diversity at headquarters, and in the research labs where I visit, they have pretty good diversity. Accounting has good diversity. But out in the field, it's almost exclusively male, mostly white. As they get more automation, there's less heavy lifting, more women take the jobs. As the hours are better and the conditions are safer, more people will take the jobs. And I think that's true with utilities as well, where the electric utility might diverse, and we have Jackie Sargent as CEO here in Austin, and we had Paula Gold-Williams in San Antonio. So we have examples of executive leadership from non-white male background who are in these positions, but the line workers are not as diverse. So there are pockets of success and then places to work. But this is a real challenge, and I would say that the greatest challenge in diversity in the workforce is in the C-suite and the boardroom. And if we can solve that part, where we get more executives, either with a different background at least, then we might make better decisions on those first two parts I mentioned about who suffers the brunt of the environmental impact and who gets the access to the good stuff. And I think if we change who the decisions makers are in the room, it'll get better. So there's sort of like three ways to think about it. One comment on France, I was working at Engie for a while in Paris. Some of you know Engie, it's a multi-utility, electric and gas utility. I was their chief science and technology officer for 3 years, and I still collaborate with them. I'm great friends with Engie. Engie has had 3 female CEOs in a row. The first, Isabelle Cocher, is the one who hired me, brought me over from Texas to France. Visionary, great. Actually, she and I are having a phone call this Friday. Really had a great vision for decarbonizing the company. First female CEO in France, and France still has some chauvinism that it's dealing with, but first female CEO in France of a major utility. Very visionary. She got fired, right? This happens. So sometimes as you break the sort of diversity sort of traditions, then it doesn't go well. Then they had interim CEO Claire, now another CEO, Catherine McGregor, from oil and gas, who is there. So you can get diversity in the boardroom. There can be bumps along the way. But what's interesting to me about France versus the United States, in the United States, we talk about diversity, we mean gender diversity, we talk about sexual orientation, we talk about skin color, ethnicity, we talk about a lot of things. In France, it's only gender. They will not talk about racial diversity. And it's kind of fascinating because in French, there's no word for race. They have a word for species. as we do in English as well. But if you talk about people being of different race, you are implying they're of different species, which is pretty gross, so they just don't even talk about it. And they take no data. They have zero information on the racial makeup of the country or of their workforce, but they have a lot of information on the gender makeup. So part of this is, if you don't have the data, you can ignore the problem and not take action on it. But if you have data, you can take action. But actually, there's something about the French language that's interesting, which is the word race actually is kind of made up. There's no different racially in scientific terms between black people and brown people and white people. It's a made-up word. It's a made-up construct. Like, the idea of race is invented. But species is real, like we're a different species than elephants. But the concept of race as a differentiator of humans actually is made up. In some ways, the French language is more accurate in that regard. So they deal with gender diversity and as a way to ignore everything else. And the other thing is, in France, they won't take data on skin color or race because the memory of World War II is strong. And the French say, hey, if you start making lists of who's who, that list can be used for horrible purposes. Like, you can target who you're going to exclude or imprison or kill. So they just don't do it. I think that's an authentic reason to not do it, but also does invite some complacency of not taking action on it. But it's sort of fascinating. I would say the gender diversity goals were pretty severe at NG. By severe, I mean like active, like get going. We wanted by 2030, 50-50 balance on management positions, which is great. But one anecdote, I love NG, but I just have to make fun on this. We had an all-hands executive meeting. The top 50 executives of the company had a gender diversity panel meeting discussion. We're all going to learn about our 50-50 goals. And it was about gender diversity. We have a female CEO and a few other executives, but mostly men after that. And the panel talking about gender diversity was 3 white men over 50. And I remember thinking, okay, probably we could have found a woman somewhere to be on this panel about gender diversity, but it's just a sign that even when we mean well, it's easy to kind of make a lot of mistakes or not think it through all the way and have a mantle instead of a panel, as I say. So those are the 3 things. One last comment, because I know time's wrapping up. Today, we released a big report in Texas, a study we did at UT 2.5 years called Don't Mess with Texas, Getting Texas to a Net Zero Economy by 2050. 2.5 years, 12 people worked on it, big lift, a big study, and we released it publicly today, and we looked at how to get Texas to net zero by 2050. Net zero meaning there are still emissions in the economy, but you scrub them out somewhere else with direct air capture or land use changes. And we looked at it, and there's many ways to zero. They're all economically beneficial. They're job creators. They're good. But one of the things we looked at was it actually improves some of the equity issues in Texas because it reduces so much air pollution that's affecting fence-line communities. So it's a huge benefit. But one thing to worry about, if you look at rural communities serving coal plants that get shut down might not get the jobs again. The jobs might show up in West Texas where the wind and solar might be or elsewhere. So there might be a demographic shift. And oftentimes we think about diversity in terms of skin color or ethnicity or gender, but actually there's a lot of diversity issues around rural versus urban. Is it just the cities that get the job growth, or is it also the rural areas? And we have to think about rural economic development so that people don't get left behind. And it turns out by decarbonizing Texas, there's a lot of rural economic development too. So we think that decarbonization brings with it a lot of improvements in some of the equity issues, although it's not perfect. And as we move from coal mining to more of the electric utility space of wind and solar, because the workforces in the latter are more diverse, there should be some natural diversification of the workforce. Still not enough, but it's at least a step in the right direction. So there's some harmony or co-benefits from decarbonizing, I would say. That's kind of my view as sort of a white guy, privileged son of a professor from Austin, Texas, who lived in France, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion in the energy industry. But we all have a perspective, and we need champions and allies, not just the marginalized having to fight for themselves. We have to work together on this. So I'll stop there. We have a minute and a half or so if there are any questions, but thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate your time and attention. So it's good to be back in Austin. Thank you. And Joyce, I think we have time for a question or two, but I can't really see you. So if you have a question. Sorry,
questions?
Or correction. I take insults and corrections as well.
Slights, arguments?
Yeah, maybe right up here. I love that. So more of a statement. The question is a typical professor theme at the conference.
As someone, obviously, I'm in the tech world, so I would disagree that there's that industry that has very little diversity as well.
Which industry has
the
little?
Tech world.
Tech world. Tech and finance are, yeah. But nursing is worse.
True.
Yeah.
I would say that, if we were to sell it differently versus the need to ask for diversity, equity, inclusion officers, and really would sell that being a minority is a competitive edge. I think oftentimes putting labels actually makes it harder, and initiatives actually make it harder for us to be included. And so as someone who's obviously a minority, I really just try to sell what I'm really good at versus gender, race. And so sometimes I have a love-hate relationship with these initiatives because I honestly think they make it worse. They don't actually make it easier for us to be in the industry and be respected for what we naturally do very well. And so that's just my experience. Yeah. And by the way, CPS is very diverse, and our board today is not a reflection of what it used to be even 3 years ago. So very proud to be a trustee for CPS.
That's great. So the labels and categories maybe help get our attention on the issue, but might not help in the long run, because then you put in the bucket, oh, you're the Latino, you're the Asian, or the something. You don't want to be sort of categorized that way, and most of us can't be categorized that simply, frankly. So I think they might be hurtful in the long run. So it's really diversity of background. You can have a lot of people around the table that all look different, but they're all children of lawyers, doctors, professors from big cities around the world. They're a member of the same global social class. You can have a bunch, and this happens in the military, a bunch of people the same skin color around the table, but some are rich, some are poor, they have very different backgrounds. It's really the diversity of thinking, of viewpoint, of background, and the outward indicators might be helpful in some cases, but it can be confusing actually, because you can trick yourself into thinking you're not diverse or you are diverse when you're the opposite. It's really diversity of background. And this really diversity of viewpoint, there's a lot of evidence that companies with greater diversity are more innovative, they're more profitable, but in particular, they make better decisions when times are tough. So they are more resilient. And I think that's really important. You mentioned CPS. CPS has a great record on this for a whole variety of reasons, but I think diversity has competitive advantage for you as an individual, as applicant. My background's different. I'll bring something to the team, but as a company as a whole, certainly if you look at sports teams aren't looking for a football team of 11 players with identical skills. They want some who are linemen, some who are faster, some who are quarterback or throw. So you wouldn't do that for sports. Why would you do that anywhere else? And that reminds me, we actually have copies of a book I co-authored in the back for you. I wrote it with Johnny Johnson, who was in the NFL for 10 years. We wrote a book called From Athletics to Engineering, 8 Ways to Support Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, thinking about the worlds of engineering and athletics and some of the lessons about building diverse teams that might be useful. But I think it's a great point. The labels can be helpful but hurtful at the same time. That's right. I think we're out of time, unless you say, what's the story?
Yep, no, I think we're out of time. Can we get another round of applause for Dr. Weber?
Appreciate you. Thank you.